The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 302 in the Massachusetts Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge William Bennett sat behind his large desk, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he shuffled through the day's cases. At 62 years old, he had spent the last 20 years of his life in this very room, dealing with everything from parking tickets to minor disputes. The courthouse clock struck 9:30 a.m., and the room was already filling up with the usual morning crowd. The air smelled of coffee and anxiety, a mix Judge Bennett had grown accustomed to over the years. His clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, efficiently moved through the list of cases, calling out names in a clear, practiced voice. Case number 247, Sarah Thompson, parking violation on Market Street, Mrs. Rodriguez announced. Judge Bennett didn't bother looking up immediately. In his mind, this was just another routine case, another face in the endless parade of traffic violators he dealt with daily. He continued writing notes from the previous case, his pen scratching against the paper with practiced precision. Sarah Thompson walked forward to the defendant's podium. She stood straight and confident, dressed in a well-tailored navy blue suit that spoke of professional success. Her natural hair was styled elegantly, and she carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than what some people made in a week. At 43 years old, she had the kind of presence that usually commanded respect in any room she entered. Any room except, apparently, this courtroom. When Judge Bennett finally looked up, his eyes barely registered Sarah's appearance. His gaze quickly returned to the citation in front of him. Miss Thompson, you're here for parking in a restricted zone on Market Street on April 15th at 2:45 p.m. How do you plead? Sarah cleared her throat softly. Your Honor, while I acknowledge that I was parked on Market Street, I believe there are some important factors to consider. The question, Miss Thompson, Judge Bennett interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had heard every excuse in the book, is simple. How do you plead? The courtroom grew quieter. A few regular attendees, lawyers waiting for their cases, court officers, and other defendants, exchanged glances. They had seen Judge Bennett be stern before, but there was something different about his tone today. Not guilty, Your Honor, Sarah replied, maintaining her composure despite the judge's dismissive attitude. Very well, Judge Bennett said, finally looking at her properly, though his expression remained impassive. Please explain why you believe you're not guilty of this violation. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out several photographs. Your Honor, I've documented the signage at the location in question. As you can see from these images, the restricted parking sign is partially obscured by overgrown tree branches. Additionally, the time restrictions are unclear due to faded lettering. She tried to hand the photographs to the court officer, but Judge Bennett waved them away. Miss Thompson, the responsibility of understanding parking restrictions lies with the driver. If you couldn't see the sign clearly, you should have found another parking spot. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around the photos, but her voice remained steady. Your Honor, according to Municipal Code Section 7.23, parking restrictions must be clearly visible to be enforceable. I believe this situation. Miss Thompson, Judge Bennett cut her off again, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. I am quite familiar with the municipal code. What I'm seeing here is another attempt to avoid responsibility for a simple parking violation. A young law intern sitting in the back row shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The court officer standing near the judge's bench stared straight ahead, his face carefully neutral. Even Mrs. Rodriguez paused in her note-taking, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The fine for parking in a restricted zone is $300, Judge Bennett declared, his gavel already in hand. I suggest you pay more attention to parking signs in the future, regardless of their visibility. Sarah stood there for a moment, her dignity intact despite the obvious dismissal. She carefully placed the photographs back in her briefcase, her movements deliberate and controlled. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that seemed to fill the courtroom. As she turned to leave, several people in the courtroom watched her go, including a local journalist who had been covering a different case. The young reporter's pen moved quickly across his notepad, capturing the details of an interaction that would soon prove to be more significant than anyone in the room could have imagined. Sarah Thompson stood at the courthouse payment window, her hand steady as she wrote out the check for $300. The clerk behind the glass, an older woman named Betty, noticed how Sarah's eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. The morning sun had given way to clouds, casting a gray shadow through the building's Gothic windows. "I'm sorry about Judge Bennett," Betty said quietly, sliding the receipt under the glass. "He's been particularly harsh since his wife passed away last year." Sarah carefully folded the receipt and placed it in her wallet. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about being heard. About being seen." As she turned to leave, she nearly bumped into Marcus Johnson, a young black attorney she knew from local bar association meetings. He had witnessed the entire courtroom scene and had been waiting to speak with her. "Miss Thompson," he called out, quickening his pace to catch up. "I couldn't help but notice what happened in there. It wasn't right." They walked together toward the courthouse steps. The spring air was crisp, and cherry blossoms floated down around them, a stark contrast to the heaviness of their conversation. "You know what bothers me most, Marcus?" Sarah stopped at the top of the steps, turning to face him. "I've spent 20 years building a career, writing about experiences exactly like this one, and yet nothing changes." That judge looked right through me. Marcus adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed during his first year of practice. "The thing is, Ms. Thompson, Judge Bennett does this a lot. But usually, people don't have the resources or platform to challenge him." A group of pigeons scattered as more people exited the courthouse. Sarah watched them fly away, remembering similar scenes from her childhood in Mississippi that she'd written about in her memoir. "Tell me more," she said, opening her briefcase to retrieve a business card. Marcus explained how he witnessed similar incidents over the past year. Judge Bennett being particularly dismissive of minorities, especially women of color. He had been collecting informal accounts but hadn't known what to do with the information. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Bennett was reviewing his morning cases. Something about the last interaction nagged at him, though he couldn't quite place why. He'd handled hundreds of traffic violations, thousands even. Why did this one feel different? His clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, entered his chambers with the afternoon docket. "Your Honor," she said, hesitating slightly, "about the Thompson case." "What about it?" he asked, not looking up from his papers. "The woman you find this morning, I thought you should know she's not just any regular defendant. She's Sarah Thompson, the author. Her memoir about growing up in the South has been on the bestseller lists for months." Judge Bennett's hand froze over the document he was signing. "The Sarah Thompson? The one my sister keeps talking about." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, placing a newspaper clipping on his desk. There was Sarah's photo, the same woman who had stood before him just hours ago, being interviewed about her groundbreaking book and her work on social justice. Outside, Sarah and Marcus had moved their conversation to a nearby coffee shop. The small cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, but they found a quiet corner to talk. "I could write about this," Sarah said, stirring her untouched tea. "But that's not enough anymore. Stories need to lead to action." Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through his notes. "There's a judicial review board meeting next month, with your platform and these documented incidents." Sarah held up her hand, a small smile forming. "Before we go that route, I have a different idea. Sometimes, the best way to create change is to help people see their own blind spots." She reached for her own phone, dialing her publisher's number. The coffee shop chatter faded into background noise as she waited for an answer. "Janet, it's Sarah. Remember how we were discussing locations for the next book reading? I'd like to make a specific request for the Massachusetts Judicial Conference next week. Yes, the one where Judge William Bennett is scheduled to speak." As she outlined her plan, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds outside, illuminating their table. Sometimes, Sarah thought, justice needed a gentle nudge in the right direction rather than a forceful push. Back in his chambers, Judge Bennett had opened his laptop and was staring at the Amazon page for Sarah's memoir, his mouse hovering over the Buy Now button. His afternoon cases would start in 10 minutes, but for the first time in years, his mind wasn't on his docket. The grand ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished silverware. Judge William Bennett sat at his assigned table, picking at his barely touched salmon as the annual Judicial Excellence dinner continued around him. His morning interaction with Sarah Thompson had been playing on repeat in his mind all day. "William, you've barely said a word all evening," remarked Judge Patricia Chen, his longtime colleague who sat beside him. "That's not like you at all." Before he could respond, the event coordinator stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight change to next month's judicial conference schedule. We're excited to announce that best-selling author Sarah Thompson has agreed to be our keynote speaker." The room filled with excited murmurs. Judge Bennett's fork clattered against his plate. "Oh, have you read her memoir?" Patricia asked, her eyes lighting up. "It's extraordinary. 28 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. My book club couldn't stop talking about it." Judge Bennett's throat felt dry. "Tell me about this book," he managed to say. Patricia pulled out her phone, showing him the cover of Rising Through the Cracks, A Journey from Mississippi to the Boardroom. Sarah Thompson's photo on the cover showed the same dignified woman who had stood in his courtroom that morning. "It's remarkable," Patricia continued, unaware of her colleague's growing discomfort. "She writes about growing up in segregated Mississippi, putting herself through law school, and facing bias in the corporate world. The chapter about her first court case as a young lawyer is particularly powerful." The room suddenly felt too warm. Judge Bennett loosened his bow tie slightly as Patricia scrolled through online reviews. "Listen to this one," she said. "Thompson's ability to maintain dignity and determination in the face of systemic prejudice is a masterclass in resilience." The Washington Post called it a mirror held up to our justice system. A waiter appeared with coffee, providing Judge Bennett a moment to collect his thoughts. His hands shook slightly as he added cream to his cup. Across the city, Sarah Thompson was having dinner with her publisher, Janet Morris, at a small Italian restaurant in Back Bay. The remains of their margarita pizza sat between them as they discussed the upcoming conference. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" Janet asked, concerned. "After what happened this morning?" Sarah took a sip of her sparkling water. "That's exactly why I'm sure. Change doesn't happen by avoiding uncomfortable situations." Back at the judicial dinner, Judge Bennett excused himself early. The drive home felt longer than usual as Patricia's words echoed in his mind. He thought about how he barely looked at Sarah Thompson that morning, how he dismissed her evidence without consideration. Arriving home, he found his sister's copy of the memoir on his kitchen counter. She dropped it off months ago, insisting he read it. He placed it in his someday pile, which had grown into a small mountain of unread books. Now, sitting in his favorite leather chair, he opened to the first page. "The hardest prejudice to recognize is your own. It doesn't announce itself with signs or shouts. It whispers in the quiet moments, in the snap judgments, in the times we think we're being completely fair." Hours passed as he read. The sky outside his study window turned from black to purple to pink. Coffee cups accumulated on his side table. He read about Sarah's grandfather, who had been a janitor in a courthouse not unlike his own, watching justice being dispensed differently depending on the color of someone's skin. He read about her mother, who had cleaned houses to pay for Sarah's college applications. When his alarm clock reminded him it was time to prepare for court, Judge Bennett realized he had read through the night. His eyes were tired, but his mind was more awake than it had been in years. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Did you hear? Sarah Thompson is doing a book signing at Barnes & Noble this weekend. The whole judiciary is talking about it. Are you going?" Judge Bennett stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror as he prepared for another day on the bench. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, older, perhaps, or maybe just more aware of its own fallibility. He picked up his phone and typed a simple response. "Yes, I need to be there." Judge Bennett called in sick for the first time in 15 years. He sat in his home study, Sarah Thompson's memoir open on his desk, sticky notes marking dozens of pages. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, matching his troubled mood. His sister Rachel arrived with groceries, letting herself in with her spare key. Finding him still in his robe at 2 in the afternoon surprised her. "Will? Are you all right?" He looked up, his reading glasses slightly askew. "Did you know about the chapter where she describes her first time in traffic court?" Rachel set down her bags. "Of course. That's why I kept telling you to read it. What's going on?" Judge Bennett removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "She was in my courtroom yesterday, Rachel, for a parking ticket. And his voice trailed off. Rachel pulled up a chair, understanding dawning on her face. "What happened?" He told her everything. How he barely looked at Sarah, dismissed her evidence, rushed to judgment. With each detail, his sister's expression grew more concerned. The thing is, he continued, reading her book, I keep seeing moments. Moments where I thought I was being fair, efficient, professional. But was I really just? He couldn't finish the sentence. Meanwhile, across town at the Boston Public Library, Sarah sat with Marcus Johnson, the young attorney from the courthouse. They reviewed his collected accounts of similar incidents in Judge Bennett's courtroom. Look at this pattern, Marcus said, spreading out documents. Last month, he fined a Latino woman $500 for a noise complaint without letting her explain about her son's medical equipment. 2 weeks ago, he dismissed an Asian student's testimony about a minor fender bender. Sarah took notes, her face thoughtful. And how does he handle similar cases with white defendants? Marcus pulled out another file. Generally more patient, more willing to listen. The average fine is 40% lower. Back in Judge Bennett's study, Rachel was making them both tea. Remember when Dad retired from the bench? She asked, stirring honey into her cup. He said being a good judge means being willing to judge yourself first, Bennett quoted, staring into his tea. Exactly. Rachel sat down again. So what are you going to do about it? Judge Bennett stood up and walked to his window. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. On his desk, Sarah's book lay open to a passage he'd read 5 times. The most dangerous bias isn't the one that shouts in anger. It's the one that whispers this is normal in a reasonable voice. He turned back to his sister. I need to do more than just feel bad about this. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected email from the Judicial Review Board. Judge Bennett had requested to enroll in their advanced bias training program, not the mandatory basic course, but the intensive 6-month program usually reserved for trainers. She showed the email to Marcus over video call. What do you think? It's a start, Marcus said, but actions speak louder than workshop certificates. Sarah nodded, remembering something her grandmother used to say, change starts in the heart, grows in the mind, and shows in the hands. In his home office, Judge Bennett sat down at his computer. He began typing a letter to his fellow judges, something he'd been thinking about all day. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Dear colleagues, for 20 years, I prided myself on being efficient and impartial in my courtroom. Yesterday, I discovered that efficiency without empathy isn't justice, and what we think is impartial might be anything but. I'm writing to propose changes to our judicial training program. He worked late into the night, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his determined expression. On his desk, Sarah's book sat beside a growing stack of research on bias in the justice system. The next morning, his clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, found a note on her desk. Please clear my Thursday afternoons for the next 6 months. I'm going back to school, in a way. She smiled, remembering the young idealistic lawyer she'd first met 20 years ago. Maybe he wasn't lost after all, just temporarily misplaced. Mike Chen, the young journalist who had witnessed the courtroom scene, sat at his desk at the Boston Globe, finishing his article. His computer screen glowed in the early morning darkness as he typed the final lines. What happens when a judge's snap decision meets a best-selling author who has spent her career documenting exactly these moments? Last Tuesday's simple traffic court hearing may become a turning point for judicial reform in Massachusetts. His editor, Linda Martinez, read the draft with growing interest. This is good, Mike. Really good. Let's run it on the front page of the local section. Within hours of the newspaper hitting the streets, the story spread like wildfire. People in coffee shops across Boston discussed it over their morning lattes. Sarah Thompson's name started trending on local social media. At the courthouse, Judge Bennett tried to maintain his normal routine, but the whispers followed him down the hallways. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others watched him with obvious curiosity. His phone kept buzzing with message notifications. Have you seen Twitter? Rachel texted him. Your courtroom incident is everywhere. He hadn't checked social media, he rarely did, but now he opened his laptop to look. The hashtag Justice in Boston was filled with people sharing their own courthouse experiences. Some defended him, but many others shared similar stories of feeling dismissed or prejudged. Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson sat in her publisher's office, watching the story unfold on multiple screens. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Good Morning America wants an interview, Janet, her publisher, said. So does every local news station. How do you want to handle this? Sarah thought carefully before responding. We need to make sure this story stays focused on the bigger issue. It's not about one judge or one incident. It's about the system. Across town, Marcus Johnson was being interviewed by a local news channel. This isn't about public shaming, he explained to the reporter. It's about recognition. We can't fix problems we refuse to see. By lunchtime, the story had reached national news. Judge Bennett's courthouse was surrounded by reporters, their cameras pointed at the entrance. Inside, Mrs. Rodriguez fielded dozens of calls. Judge Bennett's chambers, she answered for the 20th time that hour. No, he's not making any statements at this time. In the judicial break room, other judges watched the coverage on the small TV mounted on the wall. Judge Patricia Chen remembered their conversation at the dinner and shook her head. I didn't know, she said to no one in particular. I sat next to him for years and I never noticed. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother back in Mississippi. Baby, they're talking about your story on the local news down here too. Your grandfather would be so proud. By late afternoon, the Massachusetts Judicial Review Board called an emergency meeting. The Chief Justice, Eleanor Washington, addressed the room full of concerned faces. This is not a crisis, she said firmly. This is an opportunity. Judge Bennett has already enrolled in advanced bias training. Perhaps it's time we all did the same. At his home that evening, Judge Bennett sat with his sister Rachel, watching the coverage continue on the evening news. His face appeared on screen next to Sarah's book cover. What are you thinking? Rachel asked softly. He turned off the TV before answering. I'm thinking about all the cases I've heard over the years. How many times did I miss something important because I thought I already knew the story? His phone lit up with another notification. This time it was an email from the National Judicial Training Center requesting his permission to use the incident as a case study in their upcoming bias awareness program. Sarah spent her evening responding to messages of support and sharing resources about judicial bias on her social media platforms. One message particularly caught her attention from a young black law student. Your traffic ticket story is why I want to become a judge. We need to be in those rooms. As the sun set over Boston, both Sarah and Judge Bennett found themselves writing. She worked on a social media statement about moving forward constructively. He drafted a public letter acknowledging the incident and his commitment to change. Neither knew it yet, but this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice, perception, and the power of being truly seen. 2 weeks after the media storm began, Judge William Bennett stood in front of a packed conference room at the Massachusetts Judicial Training Center. His hands were steady as he adjusted the microphone, but his heart beat quickly as he faced his fellow judges. I could have chosen to retire quietly, he began, his voice clear and firm. That would have been easier. But easy choices aren't always right choices. In the front row, Sarah Thompson sat next to Chief Justice Eleanor Washington, both women watching intently as Judge Bennett shared his story. The room was silent except for his voice and the occasional sound of pens scratching on notepads. For 20 years, I thought efficiency was the same as fairness, he continued. I was wrong. Being quick isn't the same as being just. At the back of the room, Marcus Johnson recorded the speech on his phone, live streaming it to a group of law students who had started a judicial reform club at Boston University Law School. The comments section filled with messages of support and hope. Judge Bennett clicked to his next slide, showing statistics from his own courtroom. These numbers don't lie, he said, pointing to the graphs. My average fine for minority defendants was 40% higher than for white defendants. I didn't see it then, I see it now. Sarah noticed how different he looked from the man in her courtroom just weeks ago. His face was more open, his posture less rigid. She wrote in her notebook, "Change looks like recognition in action." After the presentation, Judge Bennett announced his new initiative. Starting next month, every judge in our district will participate in monthly bias awareness sessions. But that's just the beginning. He unveiled a comprehensive plan that included regular review of judicial decisions for bias patterns, community feedback sessions every quarter, body language and tone awareness training, monthly meetings with community leaders, anonymous reporting system for court staff and public, In her office later that day, Chief Justice Washington signed the official order making these changes mandatory. Her assistant watched as she pressed the court seal into the red wax. "This is historic," the assistant said quietly. "This is necessary," the Chief Justice replied, dating the document. Meanwhile, Sarah met with her publisher in a small cafe across from the courthouse. Janet pushed a stack of newspaper clippings across the table. "Every major paper has covered the story," Janet said. "But they're all asking the same question: what happens next?" Sarah smiled, pulling out her laptop. "I'm already working on it." She turned the screen to show Janet a draft of a new project, a collaboration with Judge Bennett to create a training manual for courts across the country. Back in his chambers, Judge Bennett cleaned out his old law books to make room for new resources. Mrs. Rodriguez helped him organize the growing collection of materials on bias awareness and judicial reform. "Your afternoon appointment is here," she said, gesturing to Marcus Johnson waiting outside. The young lawyer entered, carrying a thick folder. "The law students have reviewed 5 years of your cases," Marcus said. "They've identified patterns we can use to create better guidelines." Judge Bennett noticed how Marcus no longer seemed nervous in his presence. Change worked both ways, he realized. That evening, as the sun set over Boston, 3 separate meetings took place. In the courthouse library, a group of judges met to discuss implementing the new initiatives. At Boston University, law students gathered to plan their role in the community feedback sessions. In a downtown office, Sarah and her team worked on the training manual. Judge Bennett drove home slowly, thinking about everything that had happened. At a red light, he noticed a car struggling to parallel park. The driver was a young black woman in business clothes. 2 months ago, he might have driven past without a thought. Today, he remembered Sarah's words about being seen. He waited patiently, giving her space to park safely. Small changes, he thought, lead to bigger ones. The light turned green, and he drove on, ready for tomorrow's challenges. The private meeting room at the Boston Public Library was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden table where Judge William Bennett sat waiting. His fingers tapped nervously on the copy of Sarah Thompson's memoir he had brought with him. The door opened precisely at 4 o'clock. Sarah Thompson entered, followed by Marcus Johnson, who had helped arrange this private meeting. The young lawyer had insisted on being present as a neutral third party. "Miss Thompson," Judge Bennett stood up, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sarah shook his hand firmly, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Judge Bennett," she replied, taking the seat across from him. The difference from their last encounter in the courtroom was striking. This time, they met as equals. "I've read your book 3 times now," he began, touching the worn cover. "The part about your grandfather, who worked as a courthouse janitor in Mississippi, he reminded me of someone." Sarah watched him carefully as he continued. "When I was a young law clerk in the 80s, there was a janitor named Mr. Washington. He always said hello, but I rarely replied. I was too busy, too important." Judge Bennett's voice grew quiet. "I didn't understand then what I was showing him about his worth in my eyes." Outside the window, a group of pigeons scattered as a child ran past. The sound reminded Sarah of her childhood, which she'd written about in her memoir. "Judge Bennett," she said, leaning forward slightly, "why did you want to meet today?" He took a deep breath. "Not to defend myself, not to explain away what happened. I wanted to tell you, face to face, that I was wrong, not just about the parking ticket, but about how I've been conducting my courtroom for years." Marcus, who had been taking notes, looked up with interest. "The thing is," Judge Bennett continued, "I've always prided myself on being colorblind. But being blind to color meant I was also blind to experience, to context, to reality." Sarah nodded slowly. "And now I understand that justice isn't about being blind. It's about seeing clearly." He pulled out a folder. "I've reviewed every traffic case I handled in the past 5 years. The pattern of bias is clear in the data." He spread out several charts showing fine amounts, interrupted speaking times, and dismissal rates broken down by race and gender. Sarah and Marcus leaned forward to examine them. "This isn't just about an apology," Judge Bennett explained. "It's about accountability. I've submitted these findings to the Judicial Review Board along with my recommendations for systemic changes. Sarah picked up one of the charts, studying it carefully. This kind of data collection and analysis, this is what real change looks like. There's more, Marcus added, pulling out his own folder. Judge Bennett has asked me to help establish a community oversight committee. Real people from the community will have a voice in how their courthouse operates. The late afternoon sun had shifted, warming the room. Sarah stood and walked to the window, thinking about all the people who had shared their courthouse stories with her since the incident. You know, she said, turning back to face Judge Bennett, when I wrote about my grandfather watching judges from his cleaning cart, I never imagined one would actually rate it and change. Judge Bennett stood as well. Your book opened my eyes, Miss Thompson, but you standing in my courtroom that day, that opened my heart. So what happens next? Marcus asked, looking between them. Sarah smiled slightly. I think we're already doing it. Real change happens in rooms like this, when people are brave enough to be honest with each other. As they gathered their papers to leave, Judge Bennett had one more thing to say. The parking ticket, he began. Sarah held up her hand. Keep it. Consider it an investment in justice reform. They walked out together into the library's grand hallway, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. A young girl reading nearby looked up from her book, watching them pass. Sarah winked at her, remembering her own childhood dreams of making a difference. Sometimes, she thought, change comes from the most unexpected places, even a simple parking ticket. 1 year later, the main conference hall at the Massachusetts Judicial Center was filled to capacity. Judges, lawyers, community leaders, and law students from across the country had gathered for the first national conference on judicial reform and community justice. Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the crowd. Change doesn't happen in a single moment, she said, looking around the room. It happens in thousands of small decisions we make every day. In the front row, Judge William Bennett sat next to Marcus Johnson, who was now the head of the new Community Justice Initiative. Both men wore pins that read "Justice Sees All." 1 year ago, Sarah continued, a parking ticket led to a conversation. That conversation led to change, and that change has spread far beyond one courthouse in Boston. She clicked to the next slide, showing impressive statistics. Bias complaints in Massachusetts courts had dropped by 45%. Community satisfaction with the courts had increased by 60%. 20 other states had adopted similar reform programs. Over 500 judges nationwide had completed the new bias training program. Judge Bennett watched as Sarah shared their story. He remembered that morning in traffic court that seemed so long ago, yet had changed everything. His sister Rachel, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand proudly. After Sarah's speech, Judge Bennett took the stage. He looked different now, more relaxed, more human. His trademark stern expression had been replaced by one of openness and engagement. When Miss Thompson came to my courtroom that day, he began, I thought I was just handling another traffic case. Instead, I was about to learn the most important lesson of my career. The audience listened intently as he shared the practical changes they had implemented. Weekly community feedback sessions, regular review of judicial decisions for bias patterns, mandatory cultural competency training, new guidelines for courtroom conduct, anonymous reporting system for bias concerns. In the back of the room, Mrs. Rodriguez, his clerk, wiped away a tear. She remembered the old Judge Bennett, who barely looked at defendants. Now he was teaching other judges how to really see the people in their courtrooms. During the lunch break, Sarah signed copies of her new book, Justice Sees: How One Parking Ticket Changed a System. The line stretched through the conference center lobby. Each person had a story to share about how the changes had affected their community. Marcus met with a group of law students who had started similar programs at their schools. This isn't just about changing rules, he told them. It's about changing minds and hearts. Later that afternoon, Judge Bennett led a workshop on implementing bias awareness programs. His audience included judges from all 50 states. Some had been skeptical at first, but the data was convincing. The most powerful moment, one judge from Texas shared, was when we started reviewing our own decision patterns. The numbers don't lie. As the conference drew to a close, Sarah and Judge Bennett stood together for a photo. A reporter asked them what they had learned over the past year. "I learned that true justice requires courage," Sarah said. "The courage to speak up and the courage to listen." Judge Bennett nodded. "And I learned that being a good judge means never stopping being a student." That evening, as the sun set over Boston, people gathered for a final reception. The room buzzed with energy and hope. Plans were being made, connections formed, promises exchanged. Sarah watched from a quiet corner as Judge Bennett chatted with a group of young public defenders. His laughter carried across the room, something that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Marcus joined her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Did you ever imagine," he asked, "that one parking ticket could lead to all this?" Sarah smiled, thinking of her grandfather. Sometimes the smallest moments contain the biggest opportunities for change. As the evening ended, Judge Bennett found himself back in the main conference hall, now empty and quiet. Tomorrow, he would return to his courtroom, where every case would get the attention it deserved, where every person would be truly seen. The parking ticket that had started it all hung framed on his chamber wall, a reminder that justice, like change, begins with a single moment of recognition.